Hi everyone, welcome to week 3, day 3, video 1. So far we've looked at trig functions, trig ratios, inverse trigonometric ratios. So we know that if I have an angle, I can find the 6 ratios. We also learned that if we have the ratio, we can find the angle. Now we're going to spend some time doing some analysis on these functions. So the question is, what happens to the trig ratios as the angle increases? So I have a reference diagram here. P1, P2 are on the arc of a circle and I have two right triangles here. There is a right triangle OA1, P1 and OA2, P2. And I have two corresponding angles, angle 1 and angle 2. Clearly angle 2 is larger than angle 1. So I am going to use this to understand what happens to the sine values. So let's say sine A1 or sine angle 1. That's opposite, which is A1 P1 over hypotenuse is R. Now here is where the arc of the circle comes in. The reason I put them in a circle is so that the hypotenuse for both triangles are the same length, which is R. And sine angle 2 is the side opposite to angle 2, which is A2P2 over R. Now which of these would be greater? Take a few seconds and think about it. Remember, R is the same. And compare A1P1 and A2P2 from the diagram. Clearly, sine angle 2 is greater than sine angle 1. Why? Because A2P2 is larger than A1P1. Right, so if you have two fractions with the same denominator and the numerator of one of them is larger, that means that fraction is larger. What about cosine? Cosine is OA1 over R and cosine 2 is OA2 over R. So in this case, cosine angle 1 is greater than cosine angle 2 because OA1 is larger than OA2. So we see an interesting pattern. As the angle increases, the value of sine increases. But as the angle increases, the value of cosine decreases. So from there, we can sort of draw some conclusion about what happens as angle increases from 0 to 90 degrees. Now I'm going to leave this for you to fill in. We already saw that sine value increases, cosine value decreases. Now tangent, cotangent, secant, cosecant. One of the ways you can do that is you can use the calculator, plug in different numbers from 0 to 90 and look at the pattern and fill out with the pattern. And only work with 0 to 90 because if you go beyond 90, certain things change, and that's because of the nature of these functions. We will be talking more about that in the last week of lectures. All right. Now, based on this sort of analysis, let's look at some example problems. You're given this situation, the sides are labeled. Example, what happens when angle 1 is almost 90? Remember, when angle 1 is almost 90, that means this point is all the way over here, somewhere here, right? And that's the perpendicular. So basically you're trying to imagine what happens to the lengths R, X, Y as this point moves up. So how does Y compare to R? For A, as this point gets closer and closer up here, you notice that this height, which is Y becomes almost equal to R. Right? Because you see the height is increasing. How does X compare to R? As you get closer, this gap is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So X becomes almost 0. How does x compare to y? Well, the same thing. X goes close to 0 and y goes close to r. A second kind of example here. Without use of calculator, which of these is greater? Now the first two you can recall from our analysis, that if the angle increases, then the sine value increases, so this is greater. But for cosine, when the angle increases, the value decreases, which means cosine of the smaller value will be greater. Tangent and secant, based on whatever how you filled out the previous page, you can answer this question. Now for tangent as well, as angle increases, the value increases, so this is going to be larger. For secant, remember secant is reciprocal of cosine, so its behavior is going to be exactly the opposite of cosine. For cosine, as angle increases, ratio increases. So for secant, when angle increases, the ratio decreases. For cosine, the ratio decreases when angle increases. So for secant, the ratio is going to increase when the angle increases. So this is going to be greater. Once you have identified them, you can also use a calculator to verify that you can actually get information without the use of calculator. That's the end of the first video for day 3.